to preface this conversation by first and foremost stating that I am a firm Matt Campbell believer. In my video that I did about the Penn State search back in October, when I thought to myself, who would be the best fit at Penn State? Matt Campbell was the first person that came to mind simply because he has a connection to the area. He understands what it's like to be able to develop players in an area that, quite frankly, at times can be difficult to recruit. I'm not saying Penn State specifically, I'm more talking about Iowa State. And most importantly, I think he can resonate with a lot of these kids that potentially would be interested in a school like Penn State. Now, at the moment, their recruiting class has been completely decimated, ranking, I believe, 118th in the country. Majority of the kids, aside from Jacob Ford, decided to decommit. 11 of them decided to go with James Franklin to Virginia Tech. And a number of other schools also swooped in and took some kids from whether it was North Carolina or West Virginia. But fast forward to now, and Penn State, I guess, got their guy. They did take a couple swings and a couple misses. That's life. Whether you want to talk about Matt Rule or Kirk Cinetti or Kalani Satake, it is what it is. And Pat Kraft, unfortunately, is stuck with them whether he liked it or not. Now, depending on which beat writers that you listen to, or which sources that you have, I think, needless to say, since it took this long in the process, that Matt Campbell was clearly not Penn State's first choice. And quite frankly, at the time, I thought to myself, maybe Matt Campbell just didn't want that job. Because I think what ended up kind of happening was, as time progressed, people kind of realized that, hey, Penn State's really not as attractive of a job as people think. And that's, quite frankly, pretty saddening for someone like me who grew up 2.5 hours away from Penn State, someone who loves Penn State football. But I think the reality of it is that I think Penn State really just kind of unfortunately bluffed their way into the river, so to speak, if you want to give a poker metaphor there. But nevertheless, what Penn State is really running into now is the fact that Pat Kraft firing James Franklin essentially said to the entire country is, I don't care what your circumstances, I don't care what your background is. Our expectation for you is to be in the national championship game, whether it's realistic or not. That's the message that you send to the entire country, whether you like it or not. And bringing in a guy like Matt Campbell, and fortunately, you got away with not paying the majority of Franklin's buyouts. That's always a win, right? But if you're a Penn State fan and you ask yourself, hey, I've learned a little bit about Matt Campbell. I know his background, whether it was at Iowa State or Toledo. For a guy who's 46 years old and has over 100 wins as a head coach already, which, by the way, is a phenomenal stat, and I think is something that's sorely underrated about him. What really should be the expectations of Matt Campbell going into year one? Well, there's a couple of ways to look at this, right? I aforementioned a couple seconds ago about the recruiting class, how that's essentially gone. So if you're Matt Campbell and Penn State, you just got to take this with a clean slate and say, you know what? We've moved on from James Franklin. We're going to get a brand new staff in there. We're still not entirely sure who they're bringing in terms of coordinators or whatnot, which is not the end of the world, since you still have the transfer portal coming up in a couple weeks, which, by the way, I think Penn State, historically speaking, will have to fill the majority of the team through the portal, which I think is one of my concerns if you're a Penn State fan, because as you know, at Iowa State, that's not necessarily their bread and butter. When you don't have as many resources as you do there, how do you elevate a program like Iowa State? Well, you develop 2 and 3 star kids and turn them into 4 or 5 star kids. And by the way, let's give Matt Campbell some credit here. I don't care what people say about Iowa State, but he's legitimately developed some real NFL talented guys, such as Breece Hall, such as Brock Purdy, such as Jaden Higgins, such as Will McDonald, and obviously David Montgomery too. Just a couple names to kind of rattle off to prove that, yes, he at moments in time he did have NFL worthy talent at Iowa State. So that's something worth mentioning too. And there's just so much more pressure going into Matt Campbell for this job too, given that he turned down the Detroit Lions head coaching job at the last second. We know the backstory about how a bunch of seniors came back, whether it was Drew Aller, whether it was Nick Singleton, whether it was Katron Allen, whoever you want to name. I won't get into all the specifics about all the expectations and the hype going into the year, being number 2 in the country. But nevertheless, here's where Penn State's at right now. You don't have a recruiting class. You haven't won a national title since 1986 under Joe Paterno. And you're sitting right now in the Big Ten that is simply only getting better right now. You have new additions such as USC who are making an immediate impact, having the best recruiting class in the country for the 2026 class. You have an Iowa team who's only getting better. You have a Michigan team that's probably going to end up falling behind a little bit. You have a Maryland team that's recruiting at a really high level. And, I can go on. And even Northwestern, giving them a shout out too. They just won their, I think, 7th straight bowl game. So how about that? Give them a lot of credit too. But as I kind of rattle off these different names, when you're going up against the Michigans of the world, the Ohio States of the world, and then some of the up and comers like the Northwesterns, like the Marylands, UCLA, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying all those teams are elite, but you get the drift with how big the Big Ten is now. Illinois even throw it out there too. But that's kind of where you're at right now, because he's the historic all-time leader at wins at Iowa State. Historic levels of consistency. Before he got there, they only had about, I think, 3 winning seasons in 25 or 30 years, or some ridiculous stat like that. So needless to say, the Cyclones, before he got there, were not a very consistent football team. We're bottom of the barrel in terms of the Big 12. So that's something to consider there too. And what we kind of learned throughout this process is maybe Penn State is just not as high tier of a job as it used to be. Now, granted, I think there's part of that where James Franklin certainly elevated the program. And I would argue that James Franklin is essentially the biggest reason why Penn State had such big success on the recruiting trail for so many years. Recruiting at Penn State started and stopped with James Franklin. And if you're Matt Campbell, that's what you have to prove in a nutshell. What you have to be able to prove in a nutshell is not only can you recruit at elite level, but you have to be able to prove that you can resonate with 4- and 5-star level kids, because the reality is the model of being able to develop 2- or 3-star kids and being able to ask them to stay for 2 or 3 years, sit behind a bunch of guys, then you play your junior or senior year, to simply isn't going to work at a program like Penn State, where you have some of the best competition in all of college football in the Big Ten. And unfortunately, Matt Campbell hasn't been able to prove that he can win at that kind of atmosphere, right? Now, granted, he does have family in that area. He was born in that area. So it's not like he doesn't know anything about Penn State or that recruiting area. There certainly are parallels, right? But I think it's just worth mentioning before we kind of get into this too, exactly what Matt Campbell's recruiting classes ranked are. So Iowa State 2026 50th, 2025 57th, 2024 71st, 23 61st, 2022 50th, 2021 61st, 2020 49th, which out of his 10 seasons there, that was 49th was his best ranked class. Iowa State average ranked 56th class in the entire country under Matt Campbell. And if you're a Penn State fan, I think that has to be something that you simply have to point out. And granted, we're not sitting there saying that Iowa State has resources and donors compared to Penn State. No one's sitting there suggesting that. But at the same time, that simply has to be pointed out. Now, granted, statistics like that don't necessarily show Matt Campbell being able to elevate talent like that. So we don't want to be able to completely sit there and chastise him for things that he simply can't control. But I think what really the bigger conversation is going to be with Matt Campbell at this point is going to be, how can he recruit at an elite level? He has to learn how to do it. I think those who have watched Iowa State football for a number of years, I would love to hear your comments, your soundbite on this. But is not an elite recruiter. In fact, I don't even think he's that great of a recruiter. And I think in order for this to be successful, Matt Campbell is going to have to assemble a staff that has already recruited within the Northeast. I think he needs to bring in guys that can hold their own in terms of their side of the football. And for the good news, for the most part, is giving the NFL model that we kind of have right now. It's not like Matt Campbell has to sit there and be in front of 20 different parents' homes and talk about everything. He doesn't necessarily have to sign off on every single player. We're moving to a model now where the GMs are primarily going to be recruiting and scouting and signing players, and Matt Campbell's just kind of be like, okay, here's my roster. I'm going to make the best of it, et cetera, et cetera. So we are kind of moving towards that. However, Matt Campbell has to be the catalyst to be able to prove that he can get to that level, right? Because as it stands right now, being in the top 50 in terms of recruiting is just simply not good enough for where they're at right now. And, I'll preface by saying I love Matt Campbell. I think he is a very humble guy. I think I love the grassroots idea of, hey, we're just gonna, you know, pick up our straps, do the best we can, be able to elevate our talent, and most importantly, be a resource to these kids. And I love that message. I think it resonates very much so with kids who are interested in Penn State. But that's really going to be the big conversation with him. I think people know how much of an intelligent, articulate guy he is. He understands the X's and O's. For a guy who's only 46 years old, has shown that he can be a leader, has shown he can elevate programs, and has proven that he can be consistent. And right now, we've seen that level of consistency under James Franklin. But right now, the big question is going to be, can he recruit at an elite level, which we need to be able to see in this year's pass? And most importantly, how does his message resonate with kids who aren't necessarily from the Midwest, who are coming from other states such as Virginia or Florida or California to play Penn State football? How does his message resonate with those kids? And how effectively can he be at poaching kids from neighboring schools like Pittsburgh, like in the Virginias, like in the Ohio's and Michigans? I think that's going to be the big question if you're Matt Campbell. How does he show up on the recruiting trail? How does he get the most out of the players that he already has? And most importantly, how does this message resonate going from Amos, Iowa to now State College